without further ado, we have many presenters, many discussants, and before we start with the welcome remarks, we have congratulatory remarks. Video sent by Speaker of the National Assembly, Won-shi, in South Korea. So I'm gonna play this. I think it's pretty short, but you also have the remarks in English, and hope you can see that. And where do I go?
안녕하십니까. 우원식 국회의장입니다. 제2차 세계대전 종전과 광복 80년 그리고 한일 국교 수립 60주년이 되는 해에 한미일 학계와 시민사회가 머리를 맞대고 한반도와 세계의 평화를 모색하는 자리가 마련되어 뜻깊습니다. 지구촌 곳곳에서 분쟁과 전쟁이 벌어지고 동아시아에도 신냉전의 그림자가 드리우고 있습니다. 남북 관계 또한 꽁꽁 얼어붙어서 대화를 시도하는 것조차 쉽지 않은 상황입니다. 이 어려운 시기에 한반도 평화체제를 정착시키고 동아시아를 새로운 협력과 공존의 공간으로 만들어가자는 용기 있는 목소리를 조직하고 확산하는 데 앞장서 주고 계시는 여러분께 깊이 감사드립니다. 그간 우리는 한 국가만의 노력 혹은 권력자 간의 협상만으로는 지속 가능한 평화를 이룰 수 없다는 것을 경험으로 확인했습니다. 대중적 지지와 국제적 시민연대가 뒷받침될 때 평화의 토대는 더 단단해질 수 있습니다. 이번 워크숍을 통해 한국전쟁 종전과 책임있는 식민지 역사 문제 해결, 동아시아 평화체제 구축을 위한 구체적 논의가 심화되기를 기대합니다. 이 자리에 함께한 한 분 한 분의 목소리가 모여 한반도와 동아시아를 넘어 세계 평화를 만들어가는 큰 울림이 될 것으로 믿습니다. 다시 한번 동아시아 북미 평화 워크숍 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much. So if you're curious about what is said, it's written in here. So please take a look. And so that was from the National Assembly of South Korea. Now we have a member of National Assembly in Japan, who is also here in person.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants from South Korea, United States of America, and Japan, and so on. So thank you very much for giving me a floor in this very important event. My name is Mr. Hideaki Uemura, Professor Emeritus of Keisei University, and a member of the lower house of Japanese National Diet. This time, I would like to stress the importance to make the Korean War from ceasefire to end of the war, and to promote the decolonization process in East Asia. So, not fake peace, but real peace will be built up for all the people of this region and all over the world. In particular, we Japanese must be interested in and have severe responsibility for these processes. I wish you all the best for the events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll have welcome remarks from our head of the Asian Studies Department, Dr. Erica Brindley. Erica. 안녕하십니까? I want to welcome every one of you, whether in person or online, to Penn State via this symposium on war crime trials and colonialism. We in Asian Studies are keenly aware of the importance of holding conversations among scholars of Asia and the way of coming to terms with its deeply connected histories. The history of the 20th century stands out as a watershed moment in Asian history. Understanding and holding open conversation about the specific contours of the Korea-Japan conflict and the colonialism that was a reality for so long are key steps to imagining a peaceful future. The Penn State Institute for Korean Studies is especially happy to be helping sponsor such an event. And for that, I thank Professor Ju-yeon Ri for her dedicated work to facilitate this important global discussion and time for critical reflection. And of course, I also want to thank all of the other members who helped Professor Ri in making this possible for here and online. So welcome to all. Thank you. The person who's behind all this is Professor Young-Chae Lee, actually. Professor Young-Chae Lee initiated this project, and I was so amazed at how quickly he pulled things together, and he did so well. And then I look forward to our collaboration, further collaboration with Professor Lee and all those professors and activists who came here today. And Professor Young-Chae Lee, would you like to? Okay, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your introduction. And my name is Young-Chae Lee, and I'm Korean, but I have been almost 30 years in Japan. And then I'm a professor of Hessel University and a co-representative of the new era A시api스아카데미 based on the internet after the COVID-19. This year marks 80 years since the end of the Second World War and the 60 years celebrated of the normalization between Japan and Korea. Despite many conflicts in history, the two countries have also built remarkable achievements. And more than 11 million people have exchanged each other far beyond the current popularity, the K-pop demon hunters, even in the United States. But two other tasks remained unresolved: first, ending the Korean War and addressing the legacy of colonialism. The Korean War is often seen as a Cold War placed between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it loses light in Japan's colonial rule. The war tore communities apart and left decolonization unfinished. Since then, denial and distortion have often drowned our voice of justice and responsibility. We remember the great wars by their date, but we forgot how small wars scattered villages, families, and individual lives. Because colonial history has not been fully taught, many people live without knowing the history of the land they stand on or their own identity. In this reality, recalling the memories of war and colonialism here today is deeply meaningful. On this campus, today I see the neat lion sharing stand as a symbol of community pride. And Penn State, as a land-grant university, also acknowledge that it is built on indigenous land and upon the ethnic of care and stewardship. To reflect on the end of the Korean War and decolonization here with your American on our friends makes this meeting especially resonant. And most of us here, including today's keynote speaker, Professor Ujimi Aiko, come from Keisen University. Also, me is Keisen University. Our university requires both horticulture and peace studies, and it emphasizes the value of land and life. In this way, I feel a natural connection with Penn State's own agricultural origin. I wish to thank you, Professor Eric Brindley, the head of Asia Studies, and Professor Ju-yeon Ri, who is the guidance made today's gathering possible. There is a Korean proverb that you cannot be full without first spoonful. May today's small beginning grow into great solidarity and the nurture of seeds of decolonization and peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your remarks. And our last person who will deliver welcome remarks is a Professor Young-Hoon Song. And Professor Young-Hoon Song is teaching in Hwang National University. He's in College of Social Science and Department of Political Science. And I just heard that if you want to study about refugees in Korea, he is the one you might talk to. So he's also one of the authorities in refugee studies in South Korea. Professor Song?
Good afternoon, everyone. It was an unexpected introduction of me. And I'm Young Song, Director of Gangwon Institute for Unification Studies at Gangwon National University. Gangwon National University is the northernmost university in South Korea. And our institute conducts research in inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, and the cultivation of a peace culture on the Korean Peninsula, and sustainable regional development and the global refugee crisis. It is a great pleasure to meet you all here today, and I would like to especially thanks to Professor Juyeon Lee, Director of Korean Studies, and along with the staff at this beautiful Penn State University for hosting us. And also, I'm also delighted that we have an opportunity for experts from Korea, Japan, and the United States to come together in solidarity and voice diverse perspectives for building a foundation of peace on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. Throughout the decades of inter-Korean confrontation, Korean society has repeatedly demanded extraordinary sacrifices from the people of Gangwon province in the name of national security. Since I joined the Gangwon National University, I have constantly asked myself whether it is justifiable for the majority of society to impose continuous sacrifice on one region's residents. That's why I found it very encouraging when President Lee Jae-myung stated at last Friday's town hall meeting that he intends to compensate the people of Gangwon province for these special burdens and work toward ensuring that such sacrifices are never demanded again. And I truly hope that in the future, the lives of residents in Gangwon and other border regions will no longer be deliberately neglected under the pretext of security policy. The 2025 North American Peace Initiative is rightly focused on the challenges of peace on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. But through this conference, I hope we will not only address the Korea's concerns, but also expand our empathy and solidarity to embrace all those around the world who suffer from war and violence. So let us dream of peace together and encourage one another and find the courage to act together in the cause of peace. Thank you.
I am very happy to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Aiko Jumi. Professor Aiko Jumi, I think a lot of us know about her work, and I'm personally really happy to see her in person. I read about her work in the past, and it was a really inspiring work. And so Professor Aiko Jumi, for those of you who are not familiar with her work, she's the former president of Japan Peace Studies Association, and she is representative of New Era Asia-Pisaakade미. And Professor Aiko Jumi was a professor of humanities at Keisen University, Tokyo. Her numerous books in Japanese include The Japan Army's Policies on Prisoners of War and The Record of Korean Class B and C War Tribunal. Her work in English includes Japanese Racism, War, and the POW Experience in War and State Terrorism, edited by Mark Stalin and Alvin So, and prisoners of war in the Pacific War, Japan's policy in the Burma-Thai Railway, edited by Gavin McCormick and Hank Nelson. And there are many other interesting works that Professor Aiko did, and hopefully you can refer even after the talk and during the dinner. And today's talk, Professor Aiko will deliver. We provided printout. So multiple pages of printout here. War crimes, tribunals, and colonial rule, considering Korean war criminals. It's written in English. Professor Aiko will deliver talk in Japanese. In Japanese, yeah, and then you can follow this printout, and then her talk will be translated into English online and Korean as well. For those of you who would like to listen in Korean or English, you can use your earphones, okay?
内海愛子と申します。日本語で報告させていただきます。よろしくお願いします。私に与えられたテーマは、日本の植民地支配、その生産の問題です。それで、戦犯裁判と植民地支配の問題を朝鮮人戦犯、この視点から指摘してみたいと思います。1945年8月14日、日本がポツダム宣言受諾を連合国に通告します。アジア太平洋戦争は終わりました。日本の敗戦はアジアの諸民族の解放の日でもありました。敗戦後、東京ではアメリカ、イギリスなど11カ国が東条英機ら28人の戦争犯罪を裁く極東国際軍事裁判を改定しました。いわゆる東京裁判です。これとは別に日本が占領していたアジア各地でもアメリカやイギリス、オランダ、オーストラリア、中国、これは中国国民党政府などが、9カ国が日本の通例の戦争犯罪を裁く軍事法廷を開きました。これはあくまでも軍事法廷です。法廷は49カ所。起訴された事件の件数は2244件。5700人が起訴されました。これがいわゆる BC 級戦犯裁判です。判決では、刑が984人、無期、有期が3219人を数えています。この死刑と無期有期合わせた4403人の中に、朝鮮人148人と台湾人173人がいました。戦争犯罪人として裁かれた人の 8% がかつての日本の植民地統治下にあった人々です。なぜ彼が日本人として日本の戦争犯罪を問われたのか。連合国は一体何を裁いて誰を裁いたのか。ここに連合国側の問題がまた一つあります。朝鮮人の場合に限定します。148人のうち129人がイギリス、オーストラリア、オランダ裁判で裁かれています。全員が捕虜収容所 監視員の軍属です。軍属というのは軍人ではありません。民間人。アメリカ裁判のマニラ法廷では、元フィリピン不慮収容所長、本細工州長が死刑になっています。同じマニラ法廷で有期刑となった元志願兵がいます。アメリカ裁判横浜法廷では、ヨンさんの警察巡査部長がやはり有期刑になって残る16人は通訳など中国裁判。今日の報告では、帝国の狭間で戦争犯罪を裁かれた朝鮮人の視点から戦犯裁判と植民地支配の問題を考えてみたいと思います。まず、日本が受諾したポツダム宣言の10項。これには、我らの捕虜を虐待する者を含む、あらゆる戦争犯罪をこれを厳しく裁く。こういう項目があります。日本はこれを受諾しました。ここで問題になるのは、我らの捕虜と連合国が言った時の、この捕虜の中身です。連合国軍は、米非軍、英印軍、大印軍と呼ばれているように、帝国本国兵と植民地兵で編成された軍隊でした。日本軍に投降した連合国軍兵士約30万人いました。そのうちの過半数が植民地出身のフィリピン人、マレー人、インドネシア人です。日本はこれら投降した兵士を帝国本国の白人捕虜と植民地のアジア人捕虜に分けます。白人捕虜、要するに帝国本国の兵士12万5306人。この人たちだけを収容して、植民地のアジア人捕虜は原則として解放しています。しかし、それでも日本は12万を超す捕虜を抱えたんです。敗戦後、日本政府が署名していた捕虜の取り扱いを定めたジュネーブ条約にのっとって、日本の陸軍省軍務局の中に捕虜管理部を設置し、捕虜収容所を開設します。そして、収容する捕虜には、本人の名前、父親の名前、軍隊の階級、前職、一体どういう特技を持っているのか。それから容貌、色が白いか、髪の毛が縮れているか、こういうことも全部カードに書きます。そういうふうにして登録した捕虜の情報をジュネーブの国際赤十字に送っています。そして彼らを国際法上の捕虜として扱う。これがいわゆる日本の言葉で軍政上の捕虜。捕虜といっても、ただ投降した捕虜と日本が管理する捕虜を分けていきます。そしてこの12万の軍政上の捕虜。これはジュネーブ条約にのっとって処遇するという、こういう扱いの捕虜でした。しかしです。日本はこの12万の捕虜をただ3食食べさせておく。そんな余裕はありません。何をやったのか。 これです。大量な白人捕虜も日本の生産拡充、並びに軍事上の労務に利用する。これを方針にとって決めてます。これ自体が条約上問題になった。また、条約では、将校は労働を強制できない。自発的に労働するほかは、将校は働かせてはいけない。しかし、働かない大量の捕虜を帰ることができない日本の軍隊が捕虜も労務動員をしようとしました。具体的に言うと、フィリピンで投降したジョナサン・ウェンライト将軍の場合は、労働に出すことをイエスと言わない。そうすると毎日支給する食料を減らしていくんです。少しずつ少しずつ少しずつ。当然体重が減ります。で、これ以上体重が減ったら、もう生き延びられないと判断したウェンライト将軍は、自発的に労働に出ることを持っている。しかし彼は自分が減っていく体重を、数字を、郵便が出せますから、それにきちっと登録して、それで家族に知らせていく。だから、ウェンライトの自発の後ろにある強制というのが、ここできちっと証明されています。このような形で、アジア各地で捕虜になった将校が労働に強制されていった。そしてもう一つ問題が、12万からの捕虜を管理する。どうやって管理する？日本は彼らが投降したタイ、フィリピン、マレー、ジャワ、アジア各地に捕虜収容所を開設します。しかし、捕虜の監視員として訓練した日本兵を派遣する余裕がなくなった日本は、朝鮮半島、台湾から捕虜監視員を募集します。なぜか、朝鮮半島は志願兵制度はあるけど、徴兵制はその時ありませんでした。優秀な青年がいることをちゃんと分析しています。そしていずれ朝鮮に徴兵制を引くという方針を固めています。そういう朝鮮から3000人の若者を集めて、そして2ヶ月の訓練をして、捕虜収容所の監視員として送り出します。送ったのは、朝鮮人の場合は、マレー半島、シンガポール、そしてジャワ島、インドネシア、だからタイで、こういうところに捕虜収容所、はい、ちょっとこの数字だけちょっと。はい。朝鮮人軍属が勤務していた捕虜収容所の編成表はこうなっています。この容認っていうところが朝鮮人です。小系って書いてある日本人が日本人の総数です。お分かりのように、収容所は日本人がトップに少しいて、現場は朝鮮人の監視員がされています。このような日本の組織って非常に珍しい。朝鮮人主体の収容所です。はい。こういう捕虜収容所の編成になっています。そして、ポツダム宣言で受諾した日本の戦争犯罪。これのうち 連合国が重視していたのが、搭乗員の処罰問題。これは B29 で爆撃した飛行機を撃墜した搭乗員。これを裁判にかけないで処刑して搭乗員の処刑問題。それから対面鉄道、タイとビルマ。この間の鉄道建設で多くの捕虜が死亡しています。それとシンガポール緊急時の捕虜の取り扱い。これも話すと長いんですけど、投降した捕虜がシンガポールで集められます。その時に国際法にのっとるその前ですから、かなり捕虜の扱いがひどい。それから有名なのがフィリピン・バターンのデスマーク。これは投降した捕虜を炎天下歩かせて発汗進行する。それで一つ一つ話している時間がないので、対面鉄道、タイとビルマの間の鉄道、これは映画戦場にかける橋という映画は見たことのある人もいらっしゃると思います。主題歌、クワイガーマーチっていう歌です。そこで捕虜を使います。それともう一つ、インドネシアのアンモン島とかフローレス島、ここではオーストラリアを爆撃するための飛行場建設をします。この珊瑚礁に飛行場建設をする。この仕事に捕虜を使います。捕虜の監視に朝鮮人軍団が送り出されています。こうやって東南アジアの各地に飛行場を作ったり、鉄道を作ったり、道路を作ったりするときに、国際法上の捕虜、白人捕虜を動員していきます。そして、彼らが多くが死亡します。その責任が問われている。で、対面鉄道の場合、最も工事が厳しかった。この部署に導入された捕虜の部隊を見ると、イギリス人捕虜3400人のうち2036人が死亡しています。死亡率 59.8%。同じ現場にいて、オーストラリア人捕虜の場合、3662人のうち、死者は1060、死亡率22なんですね。イギリス人捕虜とアメリカ人捕虜、その死亡率の違いは何なのか。これはもし必要なら後で説明します。これだけの死者を出すということは、生き延びた捕虜たちに心身ともに深刻なダメージを与えています。ですから、捕虜の虐待の問題は戦争が終わったんではないんですね。戦後、この虐待を受けて生き延びた捕虜たち、この人たちの精神的なダメージ、これも問題でした。東京裁判はアメリカも含めてですけど、戦争、英米捕虜の 27% が死亡したと言及している。こうした現場で捕虜を刺激していたのは、鉄道隊の場合には、鉄道隊だ、日本人の鉄道隊です。工場を作るときには、工場の設営隊です。これも日本人の国。しかし、彼らが寝泊まりする、食べる、こういう日常的な世話は、朝鮮人軍の任務でした。ですから、日常の捕虜の管理、食料の 調達、医薬品の調達、これは捕虜収容所の任務でしたけど、これがほとんど不可能。なぜか、シンガポール、ごめんなさい、対面鉄道の場合は、雨季のジャングル、ものすごい雨です。これは、計算と違って例年より1ヶ月も早く雨季が来た。だから、食料が運搬できないんです。道路がでかい。あるところで象を調達するんですけど、50頭ぐらいだけど、象の背中に乗せられる食料なんかわけだけど、そういうことを含めて、食料の調達の困難中で、労働が強制されます。それで、先ほど言ったような形の、こういうこのからの死亡が出ました。もう一つの問題は、植民地の民間人の問題です。これは特にインドネシアのジャワ島はオランダの植民地です。300年余りの植民地。ここには植民者、軍人ではなくて、その植民者の家族、民間人がたくさんいました。この人たちもジャワ島だけで6万人近い人がいた。ところが、オランダは日本に宣戦布告をしてますから、その敵国人である彼らをこのまま放置できない。そのために戦争が末期になると、軍抑留所を開設して、そこにこの民間人、子供も老人も女性も収容します。6万人。どうやって彼らに食料を支給するのか。ここでも上の問題ができる。ですから、9歳になった男の子が毎日労働に出される。十分な食料がない。この中で彼らは多くの死者を出している。死者を埋める余裕がないほど、後ろにくるんで、とにかく埋めたというぐらい多くの死者を出していた。こういう日本軍の後手後手に回った捕虜の取り扱いと、民間抑留者の取り扱い、その責任が現場にいた朝鮮人軍属に直接問われていた。次の表を見てください。これはバタビアですから、インドネシアのジャカルタです。これのジャカルタにおける戦争裁判。これで何が裁かれたのかということを一応ここに出しておきました。イギリスやアメリカ、オーストラリアは捕虜が中心でしたけど、オランダ裁判では民間抑留所、これが最初から裁かれてきます。そして、軍抑留所の事件で47件裁判が起こされていきますけど、その被告の半分が朝鮮人軍。こういうような形で、捕虜収容所と民間抑留者、ここから多くの犠牲が出ました。連合国は戦争裁判に関する限り、朝鮮人を日本国民、日本人として裁く、こういう方針を立てている。ですから、BC 戦犯裁判の場合は、朝鮮人、台湾人も日本国民として裁判を受けました。 それがなぜかという人が、やはり問われていた。そして、1952年4月28日、サンフランシスコ平和条約が発効して、日本は主権を回復します。この時に、戦犯裁判、これをどう受諾するのか、受け止めるのか、アメリカと日本でやり取りをしますけど、連合国は戦争裁判の判決は出しので、一括まとめて解放するということは、一切認めない。一人一人の判決をチェックして仮放免、釈放するというのが連合国の主張でした。こういう形で主権を回復した日本の中に巣鴨プリズン、戦犯を収容していた巣鴨プリズンが巣鴨刑務所という名前に変わります。その刑務所に日本国民の戦犯が収容されています。この中に日本国民として裁かれた朝鮮人が同じく収容されている。朝鮮人の戦犯が裁かれたのはシンガポール、インドネシア、この南方です。彼らは死刑は全部シンガポールとかジャカルタで執行されている。シンガポールの場合、公主権。インドネシア、ジャワの場合、オランダは銃殺刑。で、有期刑になった人たちが、日本が主権を回復する前に、日本に送り返されてきた。その時、彼らは、韓国じゃない。日本に送り返されて、巣鴨刑務所に収容された。あくまでも日本国民。しかし、日本はサンフランシスコ平和条約、これで主権を回復する前に、朝鮮人の日本国籍をすべて剥奪しています。在日朝鮮人の日本国籍。国籍選択権は認めません。一方的な剥奪を。じゃあ、巣鴨プリズンの中にいる彼らはどうなった？すでに日本国籍ではない。その戦犯が巣鴨刑務所にいます。ですから、私たちはもう日本国民ではないから、釈放してくれと要求したら、ノーした。罪を犯したときに日本国民であったから、刑の執行は続くというのが連合国の解釈。ですから、彼らは仮釈放になるまで、巣鴨プリズンにいました。で、連合国は一人一人の裁判を、資料をチェックして、刑期を短くして釈放していきます。しかし、巣鴨プリズンを一歩出ると、彼らは日本人ではないんです。外国人だ。お前ら今日から日本人じゃないんだから、2週間以内に外国人登録をする。外国人登録をするって私たちどこ行けばいいんですか？韓国から徴用されて、南方で戦犯になって日本に送り返されている。日本の中には家族も親戚もいないんです。そういう人たちを巣鴨から叩き出す。その一方で日本は主権を回復すると、元の軍人や戦争犠牲者への援護措置を次々としていきます。他条約を発行した翌年にはもう軍事用品を復活している。しかし、これらの法律にはすべて国籍条項がついている。日本国民に限り、 だから、戦犯になった朝鮮人民族は日本国籍を持たないから、こういう援護措置から全て排除されている。それが、日本が主権を回復した後の朝鮮人戦犯への補充でした。ここで最後に問題を述べますと、東京裁判、極東国際軍事裁判では、日本の植民地支配は一切裁いていません。諸情報に植民地支配の問題なんです。国の中には2人の朝鮮総督と1人の朝鮮の司令官がいるんですけど、彼らの規則項目は朝鮮の支配の問題ないんです。ですから、戦争裁判、裁かれましたけど、植民地支配の問題は全くノータッチ。そして、サンフランシスコ平和条約。ここには、韓国、大韓民国も、朝鮮民主主義人民共和国の代表も一切参加していません。参加を日本によって拒否された。ですから、他条約でも日本の植民地支配の問題がスルーされる。そうすると、東京裁判、それからサンフランシスコ平和条約、これの大きな節目の中で、日本はかつての植民地支配をどう清算してたのか。私たちの年代の問題です。この問題に気がついていくのは、もっとずっと後で、1970年、80年ぐらいになって、韓国の植民地支配の被害者、統計通り、いわゆるヤークにされた性暴力の被害者、こういう人たちが問題を提起して、日本の植民地支配の問題が本当にリアルな問題として日本人に突きかかってきました。ですから日本の市民は彼らと一緒に活動して、いろんな協力をしています。最後にもう一つ、韓国の場合はどうかというと、戦犯は対日協力者、親日派とずっと見なされていました。しかし、2006年、対日協力者、親日派として見られていた彼らが日程強制化、強制動員の被害者として認定されました。だから、彼らもまた日本の植民地支配の被害者であるという、そういう認定を韓国がしたのは2006年、戦後61年だった。ですから、こういう問題があるので、朝鮮人戦犯の問題は今でも日本では解決していません。そうじゃないか、排除されたままで、当事者はいないけど、その見せたちが頑張ってまた運動しています。はい。こういう形で日本の植民地支配の清算というのが戦後80年経ってもきちっとされてこなかった。これの象徴的な存在として、朝鮮人戦犯の問題として報告させていただきます。ありがとうございました。
Thank you so much, Professor Subi, for sharing your research with us. I learned so much details today and realize again that there's so much work to be done. Thank you so much. We have about, Professor Lee, about 10 minutes for Q&A. Should we please? No? Oh, no time? Maybe later. Maybe we can leave some time for Q&A for later. So we'll move on with the presentation. Yeah. Okay. So I know that we do have presenters here online and in person. Fine. So let's move on to our first. We are done with the keynote speech and we are moving on to presentation by some of our presenters here. And Professor Fujitani Takashi is the first person to present. Professor Takashi Fujitani is a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto. His major works include Splendid Monarchy, Race for Empire, Koreans as Japanese, and Japanese as Americans during World War II. And Perilous Memories, the Asia Pacific War, co-edited. I believe it's co-edited with Professor Lisa Yama. Please correct me if I'm wrong. He is editor of the book series Asia Pacific Modern, UC Press. His current book projects are the Japanese, Promise of Freedom, Nations, Empire, and Sovereign in Japan's Modernity, and Cold War. I think that there is a spelling mistake. I believe it's a Cold War client. Please correct me, Professor Takashi. Asians, quote unquote, Indians, and others in an American political unconscious. So there are two book projects he's working on. Today, Professor Takashi Gustani, his top title is a Black Internationalism, and in the critique of Japanese and Euro-American imperialism, the case of Du Bois, and in the aftermath of World War II. Professor Takashi Fujitani, dojo.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to first thank Professor Lee Young-jae and the other organizers of the symposium for inviting me to participate in this gathering. I also want to express my enormous respect for Professor Utsumi Aiko for her pioneering work on Japanese colonialism and its legacies. I have depended so much upon her scholarship for my own work, as many others have. And to commemorate this 80th anniversary since Korean so-called liberation and 60 years since the normalization of Korea-Japan relations, I am suggesting it might be useful to revisit thinkers who have envisioned cross-racial alliances toward global peace. One of the most prolific Black internationalists who sought to build alliances with Asian peoples based upon his understanding that peace in Asia could only be achieved through understanding the relationship of war to the global capitalist system, colonialism, and racism was W.E.B. Du Bois, and this is who I want to focus on today. Toward the end of World War II, and in its immediate aftermath, Du Bois quickly realized that the European and American empires would not easily let go of their possessions in Asia and elsewhere, and he actively criticized American Cold War policy, including the US's leadership in the Korean War. However, several valuable studies of Du Bois have also encountered the troubling truth that during the critical period of the Asia-Pacific War, Du Bois hesitated to critique the Japanese Empire as it was unfolding in the 1930s and early 1940s, even at times enthusiastically affirming the official Japanese propaganda. So what you see here, the two quotes, the first is what Du Bois was thinking in 1936. Japan was secure in Manchuria, and to my mind then, Japan was the hope of the colored world. And the second is his views right after the war, actually the beginning toward the end of the war, about the problem of continuing colonialism of the Euro-American powers. And he said the Progressive Party, of which he was a member, had these planks: peace, stop the Korean War, offer friendship to the Soviet Union and China, restore and rebuild the United States. In this short presentation, I want to think through this contradiction in Du Bois's view of East Asian world between the 1930s and 1950s. In particular, how is it possible for him to overlook the atrocities and oppressions committed by the Japanese Empire and why did it take him so long to come to terms with his error of judgment? The simple answer that has swayed many Du Bois scholars is that even though there may have been other factors, Du Bois's overvaluation of racial ties among non-white peoples obscured his observations. The thrust of my paper here is that while a feeling of racial affinity was certainly a factor, his inability to immediately recognize the ongoing crimes of the Japanese Empire was overdetermined and included his misrecognition of the empire's plans for the economy. In other words, he misrecognized what the Japanese were doing as a positive thing for the economy. I ask in this presentation, is there a way that we might recuperate Du Bois's hopefulness for Japan and Asia, even as we carry on our critical work on Japanese imperialism? Perhaps nowhere did Du Bois feel the sentiment of cross-racial solidarity more in the 1930s than with Japan. Du Bois understood that the world's majority, that is, those people racialized as non-white, were bound together by their common incorporation into global capitalism. For instance, he insightfully noted that the commodification of slave labor in the American South, the West Indies, and Latin America had led to the forceful opening of Japan in the mid-19th century. For this labor had provided the surplus value and capital accumulation for industrial capitalism and the subsequent need for the United States and Europe to then coerce countries throughout the world, including China and Japan, to exchange goods. In other words, very early on, he showed that there was a relationship between slavery in the United States and then Perry and others coming to Japan to open up the country. In other words, the color line and the darker peoples were not ahistorical categories set in stone, but flexible ones constituted in the modern period within the capitalist exchange of goods and peoples. In other words, that the relationship was not just one of color, but of color bound to economic processes. Du Bois's most direct observations of the Japanese Empire as it unfolded in East Asia came as part of a whirlwind trip around the world that lasted from June 1936 to January of 1937. It's really kind of an extraordinary trip around the world through which Du Bois saw so many things that he was interested in and looking for an alternative to the liberal capitalist order. At the end of a 5-month stay in Germany, he embarked in the eastern direction through Poland, traversing Russia, and then spending a week in the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, 10 days in China, and then 2 weeks in Japan. Du Bois's understanding of the ties between Japanese and Black people, including himself, was certainly nurtured by the hospitality, kindness, and respect he experienced in Manchukuo and Japan. Of his 1936 journey, he noted, as you see here, never before has any land indicated that it knew or cared whether I arrived or not, except, of course, Africa. If Du Bois was guilty of not recognizing the violence of Japanese imperialism at the time, it was in part because his trip had been carefully orchestrated by Japanese officials and non-official proponents of Japanese imperialism, most centrally the Mantetsu, or South Manchurian Railway Company, which was under Matsuoka Yosuke's presidency, as well as the Kokusai Bunka Shinkokai, which is the Society for International Cultural Relations, which is actually the forerunner of Japan Foundation. And you see here that Du Bois received from Mantetsu a first-class ticket on the railway from the new capital city of Manchukuo, Shinjing, to Daiden. Yet above all, Du Bois misrecognized the character of the Japanese political economy and the uses to which Japan had put its successful modernization. Du Bois actually had a half an hour meeting with Matsuoka Yosuke in Manchuria. And Du Bois says that Matsuoka told him that, quote, in some ways, Japan was the most communist of modern states, unquote. To be sure, historians have amply demonstrated or documented that the Japanese military and civilian bureaucrats controlling the newly founded puppet state had begun to establish a planned economy that was very much inspired by the Soviet model. In fact, it announced a 5-year plan for Manchurian industrial development in 1937. In other words, Du Bois found hope not simply because Japan was a nation of color struggling against white supremacy, because he believed Japan's potential derived from its struggle against both racism and what he called the anarchy of free enterprise. Throughout his writings, I want to stress, Du Bois made it clear that while Japan and the Japanese Empire had the potential to lead the world to an anti-racist future in which planned economies would uplift the masses out of poverty and provide them with health, education, and other benefits to life, this was not an inevitability. In lectures given in 1937, shortly after his return from his trip around the world, he indicated that his vision for the future was based as much upon hope as what he believed the Japanese had accomplished. And we see again and again, as early as the very beginning of the 20th century, this term of hope coming up for Du Bois, hope for what Japan, especially hope for what Japan could do for the other people of color and the impoverished in the world. So he writes this in 37. We who watched the development of Japan from afar with sympathetic eyes and the curious tie of color, with all its memory of insult, slavery, and exploitation, can but hope that her possible leadership of the world will make for industrial democracy and human understanding across the color line on a far larger scale than the world has yet seen accomplished. So I'm the one who added the emphasis again to indicate a kind of future orientation of what Du Bois had in mind. In short, Du Bois's enthusiastic support for Japan in the moment of its rapid expansion as an empire was buoyed by an excess of hopefulness that had been overdetermined by his commitment to racial and social justice, his understanding of history, Japanese propaganda, as well as his singular experiences as a black man. Gradually, as the Second World War raged, Du Bois came to the realization that the Japanese Empire had dashed his hope. On the eve of Japan's surrender, Du Bois penned a column in which he summed up his thoughts on Japan, the meaning of Allied victory, and his hopes for the future. So far as Japan was fighting against color caste and striving against the domination of Asia by Europeans, she was absolutely right. But as far as she tried to substitute for European an Asiatic caste system under a superior Japanese race, and for the domination and exploitation of the peasants of Asia by Japanese trusts and industrialists, she was offering Asia no acceptable exchange for Western exploitation. Even as he expressed no confidence that Europeans and Americans would willingly desist in their imperialist ambitions after the war, he found hope in what he sensed was the beginning of the end of European domination in Asia. While Japan had started and yet failed to carry through the struggle, he believed that the lofty ideals that he had originally found in the nation were changing the world. He even placed some optimism in the Allied plan for Japan. He agreed that Japan should be disarmed, that its conquered territories should be freed, that the government should install democratic processes, and so on. Yet, with very much prescience, he saw the great danger of putting occupying troops on the ground in Japan for an extended period. He said, whenever white troops are put in control of a colored country, the results are notorious. So we may think of Okinawa and other places in Asia and throughout the world, making up what Chalmers Johnson has famously called the empire of bases. So just very quickly to end, as the Cold War progressed, Du Bois continued to view the world through his understanding that imperialism, capitalism, racism, war, and repression at home were bound together in a deadly embrace. While he continued to cling to hope, he saw the Korean War, the Truman Doctrine, and the stifling of democracy in Cold War America as yet further unfortunate validations of his analysis. And I end with just a few more quotes from Du Bois. I won't read them all since I'm running out of time. Where can Americans get the truth these days? Not certainly from the big business interests which own the sources of news and the persons who interpret it. We have defended the landlords of Southern Korea and the present inept regime in the Philippines. In Korea, the U.S. has committed every atrocity that man ever did to man. We have destroyed industry, farms, and homes, poured millions of gallons of flaming gasoline on shrieking men, women, and children, and turned the helpless nation into a stinking desert. I end this with this thought. Regrettably, despite the defeat of Japan and the so-called end of the Cold War, so much of what Du Bois observed about the continuity of imperialism and the suppression of domestic freedoms still rings true for us today. And yet, my goal in this presentation has been to suggest that perhaps there may be some benefit to understanding why Du Bois had such hope for Japan, and that as historians, it might be fruitful to try and recuperate a history of hope, as well as to recount Du Bois's misunderstandings of East Asia in the 1930s and 1940s. Thank you very much. I will end there.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Takashi Fujitani. And our next speaker is Professor Dong-Eun Shin, who is here. And Professor Dong-Eun Shin is a senior researcher at Gangwon Institute for Unification Studies, Gangwon National University. She received a PhD in political science from Yonsei University with her dissertation, Politics of Death, Performances of the State, Memory, and the Nation in South Korea. Research explores memory, death, and state power, focusing on dynamics in remembering death within Korea's division. She currently examines gendering of commemoration and women's political subjectivity through the Korean War and Jeju 8th dissident. The title of the talk today is Reframing Nationalist Manhood through the Korean War Widow. Professor.
Thank you for introducing. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dong-Eun Shin. I'm from Gangwon Institute for Unification Studies, Gangwon National University. So I'm very honored to be here and share my research and to all of you and one persons during wonderful journeys. And thank you for giving me opportunity to share and meet you, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the reframing nationalist manhood through Korean War widows. So this is about the war memories from the gender perspectives and from the living's perspectives. So I brought two photos. The one is a national cemetery in Seoul, South Korea, and the other one is the serviceman statues, the Korean War veteran memorial in the DC. So I will go to there day after tomorrow. So those are the national symbols that states make the war memories from fallen soldiers. However, the team of honor soldiers in the imagined community, written by the Benedict Anderson, he argues that the team of the honor soldiers is the main symbol that the states introduce the nation and make the collective national identity. However, today's the contemporary national cemetery, it has not only fallen honor soldiers but also soldiers who are identified. So they have names and they have families. It means there are many subjects of memory, not only the states. So in this situation, the state cannot monopolize the memory of death. So I have questioned that why and under what mechanism the fallen soldiers become national heroes that embody idol nationhood and in the national cemetery. So I tried to move the focus from the dead to the living to reconstruct the memory in their entire life. So let's start from the famous sentence. I really like that sentence. It's, after you died, I couldn't afford the funeral, so my life became a funeral. You know, this is from the Han Gang's novel, Human Acts. I won't explain the detailed story of this book, but, you know, in the novel, the Unsu, as a main speaker, she reports the death of Tomo, who is killed by the South Korean forces during the Gwangju democratic uprising. Of course, the nature of the character of the death is different from those who are killed in the Korean War, but the nature of the death, from the leader's perspective, might not be so that different. So it means that it raises questions: when and where does the memory of death end? So, you know, the national cemeteries and some national monuments and national symbols, etc., as a state rituals, it presents death as visual. However, death continues to be present in the lives of forever families. So I argue that our memories endure in the everyday lives of women, especially women left behind. So let's start very briefly about the memory and what is the memory of death. So memory is a representation. It's not just a recalling the past, but the interpretation in the present. So the bereaved families can disrupt state power and narrative through their actual remembering. So they can question the meaning of the death and what was the war for. Thereby, they can challenge the state authority and the state unified narrative about the war memory. So I put the war widows under the state control through commemoration. And in this sense, I try to expand the state lead commemorative practices, not only to manage and bury the fallen soldiers, but also control and manage the way of remembering of the bereaved families. And more directly, in the absence of men due to the war, they become living memories. It means their lives continuously reconstruct the meaning of death. So I brought some, I put some photos in there, but cannot, can I put the photos again? Because I really introduced that. This is the kind of newspaper. So I want to show the very old newspapers to all of. Maybe just try to. Show. Maybe. Oh my God. Oh. Can you give 1 minute? I really find the photo very quickly.
Yeah, I don't know what I can do.
Give you interesting scenes about the war widows. I'm focusing on the commemoration. So the first scene is about the women on Memorial Day. So representing the war widows and not also war widows, but also elderly mothers. They were representatives of the brave families. As you can see, the article is a part of the article in the 1953. So during the Korean War and right after the Korean War. So the mother and the widows, they're also eldest son can cook the representative of the brave families, but mostly mothers and widows, they laid flowers following the President Lee did. And also that in 1916, 15/6, the mourning behavior became institutionalized. So the President Lee Seung-man said, if you cry and won't struggle to create a solemn and polite ceremony, respectable guests here, they are foreigners, will not attend the ceremony. The sympathetic feelings are of no benefit to the dead or the living. So even though the war widows and the female brave families, they are kind of actor to mourn the fallen soldiers in the National Cemetery Memorial Day, but they couldn't express their what they feel as they want. They just need to follow what the state want to them. However, the brave families are not just passive actors to mourn the fallen soldiers. I didn't expect that I found those events about the brave families because I don't know, maybe someone who are really experts about this the topic, he or she already know about there were brave families movement at the time, but I didn't know that. It means that these events were not were not general topic in the war memories, but there was. So according to the articles, around 4,000 brave families members gathered, and notably 200 brave families from Masan, where is kind of the city of the South Korea, states a demonstration complaining that the altar is insufficient, it's worse than ancestors' rights and our own homes. And they demonstrated mainly about the insufficient compensation for the families, but they also challenged the meaning of the deaths, and they also put the responsibility to the state about their loved ones' deaths. And not only the solo, but also the protest grew out nationwide. So after finished the ceremony at the National Cemetery, they go out, and then they were in front of the National Assembly, and they complained about the insufficient support and insufficient treatment of the government and the state. So I would like to show you that interesting pictures, like the elderly women and the young widows sitting in the street in front of the mayor and officer servants, and then there are very kind of huge size. They have the demonstration. So the title of the photos is about sit-in demonstration of brave families held in front of the National Assembly. However, the demonstration cannot continue, and they cannot expand to kind of peace movement. So I suggest some mechanisms why their behavior and why the voices disappeared. So I didn't write about the Mother's Day in the paper, but I want to start from the Mother's Day. So 1956, that time was the year the National Cemetery was established. So kind of there was institutionalized commemoration. So before 1956, the war widows were not the target of the Mother's Day, just mothers with many children and elderly women, like after 70, they were invited of the Mother's Day. But since the 1956, the widows also invited of the events. So this is a day to celebrate sacrificial motherhood for the nation. So since this time, the war widows became the sacrificial in the categories of the sacrificial motherhood. And the more institutionalized situation is from the 1963. So the Korean War Widows Association was organized and became the kind of quasi-governmental body. So they are under the state's and governmental provision. So even they issued a public statement supporting troops dispatched to Vietnam War. And in the statement, the widows argue that we need to send our sons to the war because we are the nationalistic and patriotic mothers. And also they declare support for the Union Constitution, like the 1972. So in the Park Chung-il's regime, the militarized and authoritarian regime. So the war widows, the Warriors Association become very super conservative group. So, and the last one is Great Mother Awards and Great Daughter-in-Law Award. Can you imagine what they are? So in Korean, 장한 어머니상 and 장한 효부상. So the Korean Warriors Association and the government, they organize this kind of awards. So Great Mother Awards is about to honor warriors who gave their husband to the nation and raised their children under difficult circumstances. Not just normal children like professor, doctor, that kind of have a higher social status. So the mother who raises children as the kind of higher social status, they can get these awards as a Great Mother Awards. So here I also put some interesting photos from the 2023. It means very recent photos about Great Mothers Award. It means that these awards also existed in this situation. So their mothers wear a white clothes, like traditional costume to mourn the dead. So they are sitting wearing the white clothes and then get some award. However, so only they behave like a great mothers. They can be the kind of they can get some microphone and how they feel about the death. So, however, they're becoming the great mother is not easy. Even an article in 1998, the author wrote about that. No one wants their daughter to become such a great mother, and no one wants their daughter to become the great mother in the future. I very briefly went on how the widows are forced to behave as a great mother. Like the woman cannot remarry. If she remarries, the compensation will be quick. So institutionally, the widows are forced to not remarry, and then they also wear not uncolorful clothes and start parental laws in order to protect the widows from escaping from the parent-in-law's house. So there are mixed ideological norms like gender norms and patriarchal norms. So I can say the widows are subject of memory as well as object of state control. So for conclusion, widows become the answer to justify the death and violence of war. As living memories, they reveal the state control over remembrance is never fully successful, or gender norms constrain their subjectivity. So by performing the role of the grandmother, they continually reframe their husband's death as meaningful within the state's commemorative framework. So lastly, I raised further questions. Can the national cemetery coexist with peace movement? And how can death the state does not remember become sustainable memory? So just a starting point of the state-led commemoration, I focused on the dead who are remembered very classically in the national cemetery, but others. So I want to focus on the living, how they reconstruct the meaning of death will interact between the state, with the state power. So, okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for presentation. And even without the photos, it's very see. But you explained so well, so we could imagine well what the photos are about. And your story about 장한 어머니상 immediately reminded me of 연려상. It is about the virtue of women. They were commemorated by the state. Something doesn't change over time. Anyway, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Min-Chul Kim. Professor Min-Chul Kim is a researcher specializing in modern Korean history. He received his doctorate from Kyung University with a thesis titled The Colonial Role of the Japanese Government General Korea and the Response of Rural Communities. In addition to researching Japanese imperialist colonial policies, he has been involved in civic movements aimed at resolving issues related to the past, such as pro-Japanese collaboration and the forced mobilization of victims. The title of the presentation by Professor Mr. Kim is The Bumpy Road to Decolonization. Professor Kim.
Nice to meet you. I'm Mr. Kim from Penn University. It's an honor to present on the topic, the bumpy road to decolonization at this meaningful conference. I will now lead the presentation. Japanese 110 page, English 190. The legacy of Japanese colonial rule over Korea has left a profound and structural impact on Korean society, continuing even after liberation and hindering the development of democracy. This paper reviews Korea's unjust journey of unfolding its colonial legacy from the perspective of transitional justice, highlighting the recent development and reaffirming that the task of decolonization remains an ongoing process. Due to time constraints, I'll skip the first section and move on to the second. Three major waves of transitional justice. Korea has seen three major waves of transitional justice aimed at addressing past wrong. The first wave occurred between 1945 and 1949. The powerful reform that erupted in the aftermath of liberation naturally demanded the purging of pro-Japanese constituents who had cooperated with the Japanese imperiality and its war of aggression. The Constituent Assembly, formed in 1948, enacted the Anti-National Activity Punishment Act to demonstrate its commitment to reform. However, the solidification of division and the Korean War and the strengthening of anti-communist ideology enabled pro-Japanese forces who had seized the administrative and the police power to mount a counter-offensive. In particular, the Korean War brought a windfall that allowed the pro-Japanese, globalist, and conservative elite to monopolize political power. In the end, the purge failed, and the pro-Japanese forces who had transformed themselves into the ruling in a divided nation, expanded and strengthened the harmful legacy of colonial rule, such as anti-communism and totalitarianism, to govern South Korea. The second wave occurred between 1960 and 1965. In April 1960, citizens overthrew the Risman dictatorship and sought to punish those responsible for electoral fraud and its accumulation of wealth. They also enacted the Anti-Democratic Activity in the Citizens' Rights Restriction Act, who stripped the dictatorship's leaders and collaborators of their political life. However, a real Park Chung-hee military coup towards the democratic revolution. The Park Chung-hee regime, which had a decisive weakness in the term of the legitimate justification and legality of its power, laid economic development in top priority and forcefully pursued ahead with the normalization of relations with Japan. The 1965 Japan-Korea Agreement, which was concluded after more than a year of opposition from citizens and suppressed by martial law, was accumulating a treaty that failed to hold Japan accountable for its colonial rule. Ultimately, the second wave and its test of democracy and national identity were also crushed by violence. The third wave came with the democratization of Korean society. The democratization movement, which took roots in Korean society in the 1980s, led to a flood of demand for the settlement of a past issue that had been suppressed under past dictatorship. The comprehensive transitional justice policy promoted by Nomuyan administration in 2004 was one of the great achievements of the democratization movement. The Commission for the Investigation of the Truth about Forced Mobilization, the Commission for the Investigation of the Truth about pro-Japanese activities, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were established to make comprehensive efforts to investigate the truth and restore damage at the national level. The third wave had two key differences from the previous two waves. Firstly, various transitional justice issues that had not been addressed due to colonial division, war, and dictatorship are now being considered simultaneously. Secondly, this new wave of repression has been progressing over an extended period of time through a cycle of advance and setbacks depending on the nature of administration in power. In other words, the realization of transitional justice is extending in line with the degree of democratization. Notably, with the third wave sustaining the conservative elite hegemony has become impossible due to dismantling of not only political power, but also of cultural forces, which had long monopolized the memory and history. This means that the world in which authority can be exercised by something the truth and forcing consent through both, as under past dictatorship, has come to an end. Political power can be temporarily gained through election, but once lost, cultural power cannot be recovered. The background as to why the conservative elite mobilized under the banner of the new rights in the mid-2000s was to attack the concept of comprehensive transitional justice, and it is due to the sense of crisis that came with this realization. Whenever conservative government come to power, the new right force attempt to the ability people by using their power to praise the achievement of Lee Seung-man and Park Chung-hee and the pro-Japanese forces of the past. But they have not been very successful due to resistance from the public. Some of them have even gone so far as to denigrate the Gwangju democratization movement and publicly denied the suffering of Japanese military comfort women and the forced labor, engaging in historical denialism in what can be only to describe as the pathological breakdown in historical awareness. The problem is that these claims are repeatedly being raised in public forums and on the street, combined with political polarization and hate speech to threaten democratic values and order. 3. A new for recently, Korean society has achieved two significant legal victories related to decolonization. One is the 2018 ruling by the Korean Supreme Court on compensation for forced labor. The Korean Supreme Court finally determined that Smith and the Steel were legally responsible for the forced mobilization and the forced labor of Korea under Japanese colonial rule. This landmark legal recognizes the right of victims is the latest development in a long history that encompasses the negotiation between the Iwate Prefecture headquarters of the Association of Korea in Japan and the Nippon Steel's Gamaishi Steel Works in December 1945. The 1997 lawsuit in Japan and the 2005 lawsuit in South Korea. It can be described as a declaration of right for victims, holding Japanese companies regularly accountable for forced mobilization and forced labor. However, what was thought to be a legal resolution of the issue of the compensation for forced mobilization victims escalated into political, economic, and military tensions between Japan and South Korea. As the Japanese government denied the ruling and the state claimed that South Korea has violated international law, this proved that issues of the past are not merely a matter of the past, but are closely linked to the power relations in Northeast Asian international politics. The South Korea Supreme Court ruling that Japan-South Korea agreement was not an agreement addressing compensation for colonial rule, confirmed that the 1965 system, equal Japan-South Korea agreement system, had effectively collapsed legally. In other words, it declared that the 1965 system, which had suppressed and glossed over the solution of colonialism and the historical issue to strengthen the Cold War system, no longer hold practical significance. Therefore, this ruling also constitutes a significant challenge to the San Francisco system, which served as the overarching framework of the 1965 system and provided the original model for the post-war World War II international order in its eyes. The San Francisco Peace Treaty signed in 1951 was a lenient international treaty that minimized the Japanese responsibility for war crimes in order to establish and strengthen the hegemony of Pax Americana and the Cold War system. Korean Supreme Court ruling is shaking up this system and serving as a catalyst for the voices of the people of East Asia, which had been suppressed and distorted until now. In other words, the Korean Supreme Court ruling has provided an opportunity to extend the movement of settling past issues, both spatial and ideological. November 23, 2023, the Seoul High Court ruled exclude Japan's sovereign immunity and fully recognized the claim of the victim of the Japanese military comfort women system. This groundbreaking achievement broke through the formidable barrier of sovereign immunity and reflects the development of the international humanitarian law and norm. It rejects the previous legal norm that did not hold low-ranking soldiers regularly responsible for killing civilians on the other front. The superior at Iran bureaucratic and instead applied the principle of natural law to impose prison sentences. This was an attempt at a theoretical leap to break through existing order and limitation, establishing new laws and values. As such, the two ruling in 2018 and 2023 can be considered a new leap forward in the development of international humanitarian law and norms. I'll omit the rest. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Representative Peel from University. Our next presenter is Professor Jae-jung Seo from International Christian University in Japan. Professor Jae-jung Seo is currently professor at International Christian University in Tokyo and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. He has served as associate professor and director of Korean studies at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, and assistant professor in Department of Government at Cornell University, as well as on the Presidential Commission on Policy Planning in Republic of Korea. An expert on the U.S.-Korea relations, U.S. policy for Asia, international relations of East Asia, international security, and IR theory. He is currently working on regional orders in East Asia, human security, and North Korea. The title of Professor Seo's talk is Silencing Colonialism, Power and the Production of the Post-War History. I'm sorry. My writing is bad. My apology. Professor Jae-jung Seo. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for your generous introduction despite your bad writing. And thank you all for joining us in the discussion today. But let me start my presentation by asking a political question. Why are you all here in this room now? What's the point of discussing colonial past and war of aggression now in the 21st century in the US? I have a simple answer. It's not only a responsibility of Koreans and Japanese to discuss the colonial past and the war, but it's also an American responsibility. Koreans, Chinese, Japanese have not been able to come to a resolution of the colonial past, not only because they have their own set of problems, but also because the US intervened in the critical post-war period to make it difficult, if not impossible, for Asians to solve their own problems. So what we call the history problem in Northeast Asia is as much an Asian problem as an American problem. And therefore, we all have to face the reality and the past, that this is our common problem, and we have to address the common problem through genuine dialogue among ourselves. Now, in my short presentation, let me explain why I make this argument. Well, I'll proceed in 4 steps. The first one is I'll just very quickly lay out our common understanding of the Asia-Pacific War and its ending. And then I'll explain why it's wrong. And I argue it's wrong in 3 ways, because the hegemonic understanding of the war and peace silences the past of colonialism in 3 ways. So what's the hegemonic narrative of the war and peace? It's what we all know about the Asia-Pacific War. It's the war between the Allies and the Axis that began in 1941 and ended in 1945. After the war, there were war crimes tribunals that tried and penalized those who were responsible for the war. And since they were tried and penalized, it was time to make peace. And dutifully, the Allied forces and the Axis powers came together in San Francisco in 1951 and signed the peace treaty. End of the story. Peace afterwards. Everybody lived happily ever after. I'm suggesting to you, this is terribly, terribly wrong. Why?
First, it silences the question of who fought what during the Asia-Pacific War and who were invited to San Francisco to discuss peace in 1951. The obvious problem is that Korea and China were not even invited to San Francisco when states were coming together to discuss how to end the war and create peace. And the two key Asian states were not even invited. And why not? And Dulles offered an official explanation. Since only those nations in the state of war with Japan and which were signatories of United Nations Declaration of January 1942 would sign the peace treaty. And Korea was not in the state of war, and Korea did not sign the declaration of war against Japan. Despite the fact that Korea, the provisional government of Korea in Chungking, actually declared war against Japan 2 days after the US did. But the US government did not acknowledge that Korea and the Korean government declared war in 1941. And therefore, it refused to invite Korea to San Francisco. And this is very problematic when you compare Korea with other Asian countries, other Asian states that were invited. The Philippines did declare war, but did not sign the declaration of war. Burma never declared war against Japan. More problematic is Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, because they did not even exist as states in 1941. It was Union of Indochina. That was a French colony. And France fell to Germany as soon as the war began. And the Vichy government of France cooperated, collaborated with Nazi Germany. And therefore, the Vichy government directed the colonial government in Indochina to collaborate with the German ally, the Empire of Japan. So the Union of Indochina actually collaborated with the Empire of Japan during the war. And it was actually the Empire of Japan that created the states of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam after France was liberated, because the Japanese leaders were afraid that the French government would now direct their colonies in Indochina to rebel against Japan. But these realities and the facts were conveniently forgotten or silenced by the American leaders when they invited these Asian states, but not Korea. And so now let's get back to the question of why Korea was not even invited. In order to understand, we need to understand the deeper history of colonialism. When Japan's colonization of Korea was silenced or tacitly or explicitly supported by other Western imperial states. And so there was an Anglo-Japanese Alliance Treaty, twice, 1902 and 1905, where UK and Japan made a deal where the UK recognized Japan's interest in Korea in return for Japan's recognition of the UK's interest in China. And then there was a tacit agreement between the US and Japan, where Japan recognized the U.S. interest in the Philippines in return for American recognition of Japan's interest in Korea. Because of Japan's annexation of Korea was supported and tacitly approved by other Western imperial states, Prime Minister Yoshida made a claim to Dulles in 1951 that the annexation of Korea was legally conducted, and therefore there was no war between Japan and Korea. And the UK agreed with that, because obviously UK had approved Japan's annexation of Korea earlier. And UK had its own problems, that it had its own colonies, and it was afraid that if Korea was allowed to discuss the colonial past and reparations, then it might have to confront its former colonies and current colonies and their claims for reparation. And therefore, the British representative argued that the acceptance of Korea's signing of the peace treaty with Japan leads to the denial the legality of Japan's colonial rule and sparks a debate that denies Western colonial rule itself. And the US government accepted these arguments, and the Department of State stated, as it was preparing the draft text of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, that the US and other major powers deliberately refrained from recognizing the provisional government of Korea as having any status whatsoever during World War II. The fact that the government declared war on Japan and that Korean elements, mostly long-time residents in China, fought with the Chinese forces do not, therefore, have any bearing on the question. And so the fact that Korea was not invited to San Francisco in 1951 had a lot to do with the fact that Japan, the UK, and the US, and other Western imperial powers were collaborating in their colonial conquest and rule in Asia. So this was not just a Korean problem, but this was a problem of colonial rule in Asia and as a whole. Now, this silencing of the colonial rule and conquest in San Francisco became consolidated further in its treaty language. So I'm going to skip over the discussions in Far Eastern Commission, except to note that by already 1949, Japan and the US made an agreement that Japan would no longer pay reparations, because Japan was anxious to restore its economy, and the US was also anxious to support Japan's revitalization so that it can serve as a base against the Soviet influences in Asia. And San Francisco Peace Treaty, in a way, formalized, institutionalized the agreement that the US and Japan made in 1949, that Japan would no longer pay reparations. Now, if you look at the treaty, Article 14 itself, Section 8 states Japan should pay reparations to the Allied powers for the damage and suffering caused by it during the war. If it sounds good, take a careful look at the Allied powers. That excludes Korea, as I suggested earlier, that excludes former colonial powers. During the war, defined from December 1941 to 1945. So the war of aggression before 1941, including Sino-Japanese War, including Japanese aggression against Korea and other places, were excluded by this clause. So San Francisco Peace Treaty Article 14 institutionalized that Japan was not held responsible for its activities before 1941. And furthermore, Section B specified that the Allied powers waive all reparations claims. So even if Japan was responsible for paying reparations to the Allied powers themselves declined to receive. And so this created a situation where the former colonies could not even claim. And even if they tried, Japan could say even the Allied powers declined to receive reparations. So why are you guys even there? Now, quickly moving on to the next issue. So what was being normalized in San Francisco in 1951 is that whatever happened between Japan and its former colony was being brushed off because there was nothing illegal about its activities. Now, that could be seen in the ways in which comfort women, and they were called comfort girls by then, they were widely known during the war. So American intelligence had this report that discusses comfort girls, and some of the American newspapers printed letters written by American soldiers who encountered comfort girls. And so not only the US government and the military, but also American public and soldiers knew about comfort girls. But the comfort girls were conveniently forgotten when the US and allies discussed what to do about the war and peace. And Utsumi Aiko sensei discussed the Tokyo trials. And she mentioned that the Tokyo trials did not address colonial issues. Tokyo trials more specifically did not try any of the soldiers and the leaders who were responsible for comfort women, despite the fact that there were evidences. And in general, there were no trials that addressed colonial violence or destruction. Not in Tokyo, not in war trials in other places. More importantly, for Korea, there were no war crimes trials, although there were no trials for colonial violence and destruction held in Korea. I remind you, the US held war crimes trials not only in Japan, but also in the Philippines. But Korea was an exception. Now, this became formalized in Article 2 of San Francisco Peace Treaty that stated, Japan, recognizing the independence of Korea, renounces all rights, title, and claims to Korea. Right? Right? What's wrong with this? This recognizes implicitly Japan had rights, title, and claims to Korea before Korea's independence in 1948. So San Francisco Peace Treaty institutionalized and normalized Japan's colonization of Korea with its Article 2. And furthermore, Article 2 states Korea shall be entitled to the benefits of Article 2 for 9 and 12 of the treaty. And these articles deal with some issues like fishing and trading, but it pointedly left out Article 14 that discusses reparations. So San Francisco Peace Treaty made sure that Korea would not even have any basis for claiming reparations. The reparations rights were limited to Allied powers to begin with in Article 14, and in Article 21, Korea was not even included in the list of countries that can claim reparations. And that way, colonial rule was normalized, legalized, and treated as an issue where Korea can never claim reparations for its damages and disruptions. So, this brings to the end of my presentation where I define. So, Koreans and Japanese have been making struggles to come to terms with their past. And one important block that they had to confront was created by the US in San Francisco in 1951. And comfort women and forced laborers have broken the silence in the colonial past, and they brought the issues back onto the table. And now it's time for Americans, Japanese, and Koreans to collaborate to break this silence further and begin our authentic communication about the colonial past and post-colonial future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jae-jung. So now we are ready to move to the last presenter of the first session, Professor Ron Jugenberg, who is in Kyushu, patiently waiting for his turn because he's been waiting since 5 o'clock in the morning there. I hope you're still waiting. Yeah, you look still very awake. Great. So he's our colleague who's spending time in Kyushu at the moment. And Professor Ron Jugenberg is with us at Pennsylvania State University in Asian Studies Department. His research focuses on modern Japanese and European history with a specialization in memory and intellectual history. He has taught and lectured in the United States, Europe, Israel, and Japan, published on issues of war memory, atomic energy, psychiatry, heritage, regionalism, and survivor politics. Professor Jugenberg, first of all, Hiroshima, the Origin of Global Memory Culture, published by Cambridge University, won the 2016 Association for Asian Studies John W. Fall Book Award. His latest book, Nuclear Mind, Cold War, Psychological Science, and the Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, published by Chicago University Press, deals with the psychological aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The title of Professor Jugenberg's talk is Democracy We Deliver, Race, Morale, and Testimony After Hiroshima. Professor Jugenberg, are you ready?
Yes, and thank you, June. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to hear me. I know it's been a long day also there, and we're already a bit over time. So also, I want to apologize. Because we don't have time, I changed a lot of what I'm going to say in order to keep it shorter. And also, let me share the screen. The topic of today's lecture is from a work in progress that comes out of my 2023 book, Nuclear Minds, that June just mentioned, which was about basically the politics of trauma and memory in Hiroshima, or actually the prehistory of trauma and memory of trauma and trauma research in Hiroshima and the Holocaust before the invention of PTSD. What I didn't really expected when I did this research, and this is what I'm part of what I'm working on now. We already have one article coming out on this, but this what I'm talking today about the second article is the fact that the internment camps of the Japanese Americans will show up, as well as a whole bunch of other issues connected to the democratization of Japan, which also led me to one of long-standing issue I had with the history of Hiroshima, which I'm researching, which is the making of the message of Hiroshima to fit the American message after the war. What I realized that when I came to look at the first psychologists and others that went to Hiroshima after the bomb, is that they, first of all, did not think about a bomb as something separate from the fire rates, right? It was some kind of a continuation. And the second, that they connected it to democracy and democratization of Japan, right? What I'm going to talk about today, and very, very briefly, it's about the connection between fire rate, A-bomb, democracy, and the taming of Hiroshima through the lens of one guy, Japanese American named Scotty Matsumoto, who I was very lucky to have his papers, talk to his family, and research quite a lot about for the book and later on, who made his journey from internment camps to Hiroshima. He stayed in Hiroshima until 1969. The second topic that kind of connects all of it, beside the Japanese-American topic, is the issue of morale. This term, a psychological term, they use in order to justify bombing, right? And it was used over throughout all combatants used by all combatants during the war. The main lens through which, again, the Japanese-American lens actually lead me to the main question that I ask in the paper we just going to get published, is the issue of race in Japan. Now, there is a whole following Dower. There's a whole debate about the role of race in the dropping of the atomic bomb, which I'm not going to get into it. Also, I'm not going to read this. You're going to read it in the interest of time. But you can see that John Dower, in his classic book, War Without Mercy, connect the issue of racism to bombing. Likewise, people who worked on morale and psychological warfare, like, for example, Jeffrey White Weber recently, last year in a book, saw people who worked on morale, right, as people, morale, those psychologists and others that I'm talking about in here, Clyde Clutchell, who's an anthropologist who worked in internment camps, as people were basically employing different logic to the bombing of Germany and the bombing of Japan. Meaning, for the bombing of Germany, again, not connecting fire rates and a bomb. They saw it as a form of liberal governmentability, right? Strategy to influence and curse essentially rational actors, right? But for the Japanese, it was different. Somehow they're irrational, fanatical, but we can change them into Democrats. I disagree. Okay, I think it's much more complex. I'm not saying there's no racism. Of course, there's a whole bunch of racism. There's a lot of racism, but the project in Japan and Germany was basically the same, I want to argue. And you can see it through the question of morale, right? And you can see it through the role of Japanese Americans. So if you take the question of morale, very quickly, you see that across all combatants, and you see those three quotes I brought here from Germany, Japan, and the US, the idea that when you bomb people, you don't just kill them. Of course, you target their mind, and the war happened in the mind, right? There is a kind of a contest between the bomber and the bombers and civil defense about the will of the people to fight, the morale, or sen'i in Japanese. This is again transnational. Both the bombers, in this, the Japanese bombing China or Americans bombing Tokyo, basically had the same idea, right? It was transnational. It's something that happened also, it started already in the 30s and 40s. And what you have with the establishment of the United States bombing survey, the whole scientification of bombing, is basically Americans putting an operational research apparatus to check if this actually works. And this happened after the bombing, of course. What the Americans were aiming for, right, was for some kind of 1919 style, Germany 1919 style democratic revolution, right? That they will bomb the Japanese until they will rise up and topple down the Japanese government, which is exactly what the Japanese elites feared. They feared a revolution. So in order to check, and this is my greatest kind of surprise in research, in order to check to see if bombing worked, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sent psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists into Hiroshima in September, October 1945, very, very close after the bomb, to see if this actually worked, if bombing actually led to some kind of an uprising, lowering of morale that would lead to democracy. The thing is, again, when they come, they didn't come on a terra nova where no one knew what they were talking about. The Japanese government had this exact same fear, as you can see here by this 1944 newspaper article that talk about how bombers are basically the enemy is aiming at your heart, and you have to chase America away. So not heart, brain. Of course, in Japanese, brain and heart is the same thing. So, sorry, I'm talking too fast. Lower down. Sorry, I'm very conscious of the time. So, all right. So, let's go. So this is morale, right? Let's go to Japanese American. Why Japanese American role is complicating these things? Because the Japanese American roles, which is always very complex, bring the question from the American side and the Japanese side, a question of race again, right? So if the Americans were aiming democracy, what is the role of Japanese Americans? And this again bring back the question of race. So if you're looking at from the point of view of Scotty Matsumoto, he was very conflicted. Again, it's very messy. There's not just one dialogue. On one hand, you feel the Americans are using Gestapo methods. You feel humiliated when they take him to the camps, right? On the other hand, when he's sent from the camps, recruited to work for the bombing campaign, he was sent to Chicago to learn sociology, right? And like a lot of African Americans, I'm not going to get into Del Monte argument right now. He's fighting for the Americans. He kind of drank the Kool-Aid. He believed that if you will fight for America, you will fight for a dual victory over racism at home and totalitarian abroad. The problem is when it comes to the Office of War Information and Foreign Morale Division, where he worked, there's plenty of racism to go about. I'm not going to get into the total debates, but basically, it's not a clear cut. It's not racist versus non-racist, but there is a whole, who wins the debate eventually are the non-racists, or to use Fujitani sensei, where the polite racism, right? Not the vulgar racist. So when the strategic survey come to Japan, they look at the Japanese as rational actors, right? And they ask them, really want to assess them as rational, what the bombing did to you. And this is a scene that really blew my mind. They're going around Hiroshima with little kind of, how do you say it in English? I forgot, like pads, right? And asking questions politely about how they feel about the bomb. Now, if they're racist, why do you care about people's feeling, right? But they do, because this is a part of a whole opinion poll to see if the Japanese actually changed their mind, right? And the experience of bombing actually led them to democracy. What they want to do, and this is a scene from a movie that I always show my students our job in Japan, is to, and there's a quote from that, is to look how we can change Japanese attitudes through debate. Of course, this is, again, very racist, but not the same way as the racism that John Dower talks about, right? It's about the Japanese are just like us and we can change their minds. Of course, we're still the teachers and so on, but we can change their minds, right? And you can see it in the survey, right? The survey basically meant going around Japan and asking people, right, what they felt about bombing and what they felt about democracy. And here the Japanese are very important because people actually doing the questioning are mostly Japanese Americans. A lot of white Americans, officers had Japanese language training, but it was not very good, right? They couldn't do their job without Japanese Americans. The Japanese Americans actually have a dual role, actually a triple role. First, as people who ask questions. Second, as people who show the Japanese, right, that you can be democratic. And third, because the white Americans, and actually a lot of the Japanese Americans did not really speak very good Japanese, the Japanese Americans in Hiroshima, and there were quite a lot of them, actually had a disproportionate influence on the survey. They actually talk much more with Japanese Americans than with Japanese, because that's the one you can talk about. So, for example, this Lieutenant Lawrence Vincent here talked with Mr. Hashimoto, and he's very impressed by her shot of American democracy. because the fact that Japanese Americans dislike the emperor system, right, is actually showing that Japanese can be democratic, right? Another thing, again, that I plan to talk about and not talk about is that those, actually, I will talk just a little bit. Okay, I have a bit of time, 2 minutes. Is that because they connect democracy to bombing, and because what they do is basically asking people about the bombing experience, what you have here is the first testimonies that produced in Japan are those testimonies. A lot of them got published later on, right? Are by the USSBS, right? And in here, a lot of them made this connection between the bombing and democracy. Why? Because they have American soldiers standing in front of them and they tell American soldiers they're smart, right? They tell American soldiers what they want to hear, right? So going back to the taming of Hiroshima, right? And also Matsumoto's story, right? Eventually, that I wish I can talk much more about. What you have here is this connection between morale, bombing, and democracy that on the ground in Hiroshima in 1945-46 turned into this first testimony that always connect democracy, peace, and the bomb. The peace and the bomb. And Japanese American had a very important role in it. I bring you here, I want to end with this newspaper from August 6, 1946, 1 year for the bomb. They talk about the bright flash of peace, Heiwa no Senko, right? That calls a bomb a force that is transformed in instant the base of militarism in Hiroshima and a city of peace, right? In the context of all the other talk we had today, it was about washing away Japanese sins and Hiroshima being reborn, being transformed into a democratic, peaceful country. And Japanese Americans had a very important role in showing Japanese that it can be done. And Matsumoto himself, having stayed in Hiroshima, married a Japanese, actually worked in ABCC and other places, was in himself a living testimony. Of course, it's much more complicated. His story is more complicated. He was very conflicted about this whole thing. He was very shocked by what he saw in Hiroshima. He was very pathetic to survivors. There's a lot of complications, but the overall story that the Americans and Japanese elites are telling themselves and this impact and testimony, it lies in this moment in 1945, 1946, when the bombing survey came to Japan. And I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zwigenberg. And the second session is over, and we are moving towards the last session. That last session is more like a round table discussion. So each presenter has a shorter presentation time, 5 to 7 minutes. And I would like to ask each presenter to keep the time limit or straight to it. And so we'll start without a break. Is it okay? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much. So our first discussant, Professor Dong-Chun Kim from Seongong-Hae University, South Korea. Professor Dong-Chun Kim served the Korean government as the Standing Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He also has acted as an organizer of progressive academic movements since the 1980s and has participated several civil movements in South Korea. In 2004, the 한겨레, which is a newspaper, nominated him as a member of 100 People Who Will Lead Korean Society. He was awarded the 20th Hanse Prize in 2005 and 15th Song Lun-ho Medal Prize in 2016 by his academic achievements and social activity. I must add that so many people are still reading his great history book on the Korean book. Professor Dong-Chun Kim.
Inviting me this seminar as a commentator for several articles. We cannot cover all these issues, but I want to give you my impression about the presentations, especially Jimmy Aiko's achievement, very impressive for us Koreans, because she focused on just the uncovered aspect of BC like war criminals after the Second World War. I want to say something about colonial legacy and Japanese and American Cold War policy overshadow colonial memory of Koreans and in general. The problem, I think, as far as I know, I couldn't find any comparative studies of colonialism or general history of colonialism in general. Some studies on colonialism generally focusing on the Western imperialist colonial policy against Africa, South America, and other countries. In Asian or East Asian cases are generally omitted in the history of colonialism. Especially, I try to find some comparative studies of Japanese colonialism in Asia. For example, in Taiwan and Korea. Unfortunately, there is no comparative studies of Japanese colonial policy in Taiwan and Philippines now. And French colonial policy in Vietnam and Algeria, and English colonial policy in India and other West Indian islands, and Portuguese colonial policy in South America. No such a kind of general theory of colonialism. Japanese colonization on Korea is maybe some general characteristics of colonialism, but the special and the peculiar aspect we have. So how we can divide in the general aspect of colonialism and specific characteristics of colonialism in Korea. The main concept is racism. Korea and Japan, you may know, is mostly same race and a similar cultural history and similar steps of development, but time gap of opening. And this kind of colonization is very peculiar in the world. But in terms of violence against the colonized people and enslavement, the aspect of enslavement is almost same. But we don't say the strengths of the steps of violence in imperial policy on Asia and Africa and South America. We cannot say the general theory on this issue. Anyway, and another point is the concept of war and colonization. Among Japanese, no concept of colonization, only war. War against America, war against China, no war against Koreans, because Koreans was colonized, totally colonized. So we cannot find the concept of war, colonization among Japanese and among Americans. This is the partner of imperialist country, United States and Japan. So how we can say about the concept of colonization in the last 20th century? And we know there are three aspects of Second World War. One is the war against the imperialist country, and second, then the hegemonic struggles between United States and England. So the national liberation war against imperialism. the third point is totally omitted in history of World War II, global history. We should rewrite the global history. When we rewrite the global history of Second World War, we can find some findings of Schmidt-Eichels and other presenters' perspective of imperialism and colonialism. And the third point I want to say is that the Cold War overshadowed the history of colonialism. As Professor Zelle also mentioned in the San Francisco Peace Treaty, also the overheld the memory of colonization and colonialism. And so the history of Cold War also reshaped the history of not just Korea as the Korean national division, and the similar kind of history we can find in Palestine. The implementation of a new state, Israel, and the legacy of the unaccomplished project of liberation or the post-war dealing with the post-war legacy still remains in Palestine and Korean Peninsula. Almost the similar kinds of phenomena still exist, not just in Palestine, in Korea. But generally, most Koreans don't appreciate the similarity of Palestine and Korean Peninsula. This is the ignorance of not just the Japanese ignorance, but Korean ignorance of their own history of Cold War and colonization. Only they focus on Japanese imperialism and how American dominated Cold War policy overshadowed the global politics. Koreans, generally Koreans and Japanese don't appreciate, never learn in school and by media. And finally, I want to say the racism. The racism, you know, under the Great East Asian War, 대동아 전쟁, by Japanese, Koreans, some Koreans elites and ruling elites collaborate with Japanese imperial policy, pro-Japanese. They sympathize Japanese policy on the logic of racism. Our yellow people should fight against white. But after then, when Korea liberated from Japanese colonialism, new kind of legitimation of colonialism soared over after 1980s, 1990s, new right groups in Korea by modernization. The colonial modernization, the theory also legitimized Japanese colonization. But this is not the new theory. It was originally developed by the United States. The modernization, development, accompanied with anti-communism, began in late 1950s. By U.S. policy, U.S. concept of development and modernization also overshadowed the legacy of colonialism. And okay, now Korea, we have some scholars who support the theory of colonial modernization. They also legitimized Japanese colonization. And there are long history of legitimation of colonial inquiry by Koreans, not just by imperialists or Japanese or American ruling elites, but only Koreans also sympathize the kind of theory. I don't think most Koreans sympathize the kind of theory and legitimation, but we should overcome all these legacy of 20th century history of colonization and imperialism. Thank you.
Our next person is Professor Lisa Yoneyama, who is in Toronto, who's teaching in University of Toronto. Professor Yoneyama is a professor at the University of Toronto, received her PhD in anthropology. from Stanford University and taught cultural studies at the University of California, San Diego, where she also served as a program director for critical gender studies. Her research focuses on the politics of memory, violence, and justice, with a special emphasis on war, race, and colonialism, gender, queer feminism, nuclearism, and trans-Pacific Cold War and post-Cold War knowledge production. Professor Yoneyama.
Thank you. Thank you, organizers and co-organizers, and especially Professor Lee Young-jae for the invitation to this very important workshop. For the sake of time, I'll read from a prepared text. I'd like to bring the following question to the roundtable. What does it mean to commemorate the 80th anniversary of Korea's liberation at the end of Asia-Pacific War, alongside the 60th anniversary of the signing of ROK Japan Basic Treaty? What kinds of questions emerge when we connect these two historical junctures, 1945 and 1965? I would address these questions by highlighting how Professor Utsumi's keynote speech, but also her lifelong achievements and scholarship directly speak to this particular intersection. For the past couple of decades, my work has focused on the significance of transnational redress culture that became especially reinvigorated after 1990s, aiming to seek justice from victims of Japanese wartime violence. What I refer to as the post-90s justice culture, redress culture, has been a major force in revealing the profound failures of transitional justice in the immediate aftermath of Asia-Pacific War. That atrocities such as Japan's military confrontation system and the biological experiments conducted by Unit 731 were neither addressed during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal or in subsequent normalization treaties, nor fully brought to light for nearly 40 years, illustrates such failures. The post-war transitional justice commenced the culture of impunity that would serve U.S. geopolitical interests, ultimately rebuilding Japan as part of the anti-communist client state network in the Asia-Pacific region. What is significant, however, is that the post-90s redress culture did not simply seek to fill the gaps or correct past oversight. Rather, in its belatedness, it has posed radical challenges to the very post-World War II order that enabled these silences and omissions in the first place. Since the late 1980s, Professor Utsumi has been among the first to draw attention to the absence of acknowledging colonial violence, especially Japan's colonial violence in Korea and Taiwan, in the adjudication of Japan's war crimes. Utsumi's scholarship was path-breaking in that it insisted on the need to address Japan's colonialism and war responsibility not in isolation but in conjunction, while at the same time situating these issues in relationship to the post-colonial predicaments faced by Zainichi Koreans in Japan. While the previous criticism of Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal pointed out the problems of impunity given to such individuals as the Japanese monarch Hirohito and Kishi Nobusuke, to name a few, the critiques advanced by Utsumi and other historians have laid bare how the tribunal left the injustices of Japanese colonialism largely unquestioned, effectively legitimizing the colonial legacies and neo-colonial relations across Asia and the Pacific. The tribunal did not hold Japanese political and military leaders accountable for the atrocities they committed against people of Asia and the Pacific Islands. Rather, they were prosecuted primarily for disrupting the peace and geopolitical order maintained by Western imperial powers and for infringing upon their colonial entitlements, properties, and privileges in the region. Furthermore, Utsumi problematized the shortcomings of the state-to-state reparations agreement because they were largely aimed at stimulating industrialization and economic development. They ultimately led to the corruption and plutocracy involving state leaders and multinational corporations. the post-90s redress culture is deeply connected to the intellectual genealogy of critiques advanced by scholars like Professor Utsumi. The transnational redress culture, at its most radical core, has interrogated the post-World War II Cold War formations that disavowed many instances of Japanese imperial violence, thereby leaving intact colonial structures of impunity and uneven economic development. In this context, the fact that it took another 20 years after Korea's liberation to normalize diplomatic relations between the Republic of Korea and Japan, and the intense struggles and protests surrounding the treaty underscore the difficulty of addressing colonial restitution. And this difficulty, of course, also extends to the efforts to bring justice to the violation against women under Japanese colonial rule and occupation. What becomes visible when we connect the two historical moments of 1945 and 1965 is the failure of decolonization and its lasting implications for ongoing struggle for radical transformation. And Professor Kim Min-cheol's presentation was quite a hopeful one in many regards with the recent adjudication and judgment in the Korean juridical venue. In closing, I want to reflect briefly on the role of UN Security Council as an emblem of the broader structural limit in the post-World War II framework of justice. Does it not embody the same geopolitical logic that shaped the Tokyo Tribunal and underpin much of the post-war transitional justice? Dominated by the victors of World War II, many of whom were themselves colonial imperial powers, and all possessed nuclear weapons, the Council has historically functioned not as a guarantor of justice for the colonized, but as a mechanism for preserving the global status quo. And I haven't begun to touch on the uneven application of international law that criminalizes the mass killing of civilians that extends to what we're witnessing in Gaza today. In this light, the failure of decolonization in Asia and the Pacific can be seen as a symptom of a deeper global structure that emerged in the aftermath of 1945. Any critical engagement with the legacies of 1945 and 1965, especially from a decolonial perspective, must therefore confront the limits of the institution they produced and imagine new frameworks for justice, one that moves us beyond the existing international order and the habitual way in which we speak of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Yoneyama. Now, our next discussant is Professor Jan Thompson. Professor Jan Thompson is the president of a very important society called the American Defenders of Bataan and Parade Leader Memorial Society and professor and the director of the School of Journalism and Advertising at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. A professional work revolves around the American prisoner of war experience of the Imperial Japanese during World War II. She has produced 3 documentaries, a book, and numerous articles on this topic. Recently, a newspaper article published just a day ago. And her most recent professional work regarding the POW experience is the 8-episode podcast, Ben Steele, American, that is offered on Spotify and Amazon Radio, narrated by Alec Baldwin. Professor Jan Thompson co-produced, wrote, and edited the series. Professor Jan Thompson. Please welcome Professor Jan Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to this important event. So I'm looking at everything through a different lens because of who I am, which is the child of a prisoner of war. And when you're talking about the 80th anniversary, I'm thinking of the 80th anniversary of victory over Japan, VJ Day, which was September 2nd. And because of my research, it has really opened my eyes to other areas of East Asia and how they suffered as well as my own father. And I can't, I have to say that, I can remember my dad saying he was in prison camps in the Philippines, that it was the Korean guards that seemed to be the most brutal. And it could be just because of the higher ranking that would be happening in the camps. My father often kind of referred to it like the Three Stooges. I'm not sure if any of you guys have seen the Three Stooges, but if a higher ranking officer came in, they would slap the one just below him, who would turn around and slap the one below him in rank. And then I think they would go run and find the Korean guard and slap him, and then the Korean guards would come run for the POWs. And of course, they were hiding. I think one of the things that I would like to share with you, because your title is Rethinking the Past of Conflict, Imagining the Future of Peace in East Asia. And I think a real strong component of this is got to be reconciliation. And it's not, it doesn't come easily. And one of the things that we have been involved in has been what is called the Japan POW Friendship Program, which was where Japan invited our former POWs back to Japan to see a new Japan, because these men only could remember what had happened to them in the prison camps. When they'd left Japan or Manchuria or the Philippines, it was devastated by war. And these trips were transformational for these men, and often their children would accompany them, and it was often daughters. And what I would hear afterwards was that the nightmares stopped, that they finally were starting to come to peace. And so, when I think about these things, it's how do you reach out across the aisle, as what we've been trying to do with Nippon Steel, in that was the article that was being referred to, because we've been trying to have a conversation. I think I've heard that today. And conversations are the beginning, I think, of what's really important, which is reconciliation. And unfortunately, no one has responded to my letters or anything like that. But I do believe that that's where things begin. And I would like to share also with you something that had happened several years ago, that where we have gotten the only formal apology from a company that used Americans and Allied prisoners, an apology, and that was Mitsubishi Materials. And as I sat in that room, it was at the Wiesenthal Center, which is in LA. As I sat in that room and I saw the men representing Mitsubishi Materials, it really struck me that this was a younger generation. They had nothing to do with the war. Yet this was the right thing for them to do. This was the right thing for their company to do. And what we were able to achieve was also that they were going to put in their company history what had happened, to the prisoners of war, that's on plaques in front of their minds, etc. And this is the ideal situation that I see with Nippon Steel, that you can't forget history, please acknowledge it. You shouldn't forget the victims. You've got to remember the victims. And I think what I'd like to try to say as sort of a conclusion is, it's your research, it's my research. We have to continue to drown out any denial that anything had happened, because this did happen. This happened to millions of people what happened during World War II. And the scholarly research that I'm hearing today has to continue to tell these stories about the victims and those who suffered, because that, I think, is what's important for us to be able to succeed, to have a peace and to continue to have a peace in East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thompson. Our next discussion is Professor Hong Kao. And I'm personally really happy.
Just mention,
Yeah.
and we are running out of time. So shall we give a turn to those who are there online? Because we'll have dinner, so I'm sure that I will have opportunity to continue our discussion.
Okay.
I would like to, let
But
them
then
first.
we have Dr. Yu Kang here,
Yeah, okay.
right? So you don't wanna.
I could, I didn't know. However.
So if you could kind of
Yeah.
shorten it.
Sorry, but to transfer, do you have to put the
Would you like to? Are you okay? Yeah. She was my sensei at York University. She was in my dissertation committee. We've been collaborating on a lot of works since then. So I'm really happy to be here. So please.
Thank you so much for having to let me have this chance. I'm a historian of arts, and then so I was thinking about history, and then history matters. History matters, especially history of violence, past violence, and the handling of the violence. So, I'm not really asking questions, but I just want to share the reflections that I have from these wonderful presentations. Like, to understand what's going on now, what we see, what we witness, not only East Asia, not only the US, but globally, I think then history kind of gives our sense what to do, right? And I'm thinking about the violence that is going on some other parts of the world. And then 30 years later, 50 years later, I mean, what kind of questions, right, future generation will give us, right? What did you do, right? Why did you handle that way? Something like that. So I really thinking about the history really matters. In order to understand us today, we have to revisit the history and past because answers are there, right? So I'm thinking I have a kind of the insights that I have, especially from Professor Zwinberg, and I really like to read his article and work on race, morale, and bomb. That kind of gives me a question, and that especially what is fascinating is that like the bombers, right? They were actually aiming hearts and mind, right? So they really kind of touched me. And then, yes, bombers, right? Not only destroying the materials and human lives, but they're kind of targeting in hearts and mind. And then after the Hiroshima, they asked question, how did you feel, right? So that really reminds me of what's going on. We see the bombings, right? Over there, and then how we gonna cope with this current violence, right? And then to Professor Hoshitani's Black internationalism and critique of Japanese Euro-American imperialism. And I have to read his work with more attention. I don't think I fully understand what he wrote. But again, his presentation kind of gave me the thing about BLM, Black Lives Matters movement, and Asian solidarity and BIPOC movement. They kind of get to slippage at the same time, solidarity. between different race groups. And in the context of continuing imperialism, of course, imperialism now has different the features, but they kind of bipolar relations and continuing violence and imperialism. And then that is so I think his article, his presentation was very insightful to understand today. And Professor Shin, I have a lot of questions because we have overlapping research interest. And then I was kind of curious if there were any record that you have come across, especially about bereft mothers of daughters like nurse and who were sacrificed during the war. But yeah, whether you have come across any record that talks about women and daughter, mothers of a daughter and so yeah, that is kind of my curiosity. And then others, Professor Uchimi, and this is not a really question, but that really made me think that why she has been into that question of Korean War criminals as a Japanese scholar and activist. And I want to know whether there are equivalent or comparative studies on Korean War criminals and what will be the continuity and difference between Professor Uchimi's work and the Korean scholars' work, if there are studies on that. And then, and Professor Kim, I was thinking about whether are we in the fourth wave in dealing with liquidation of the past, or we are not yet fourth wave because now we have a new president. And then should we be hopeful about entering the fourth wave or not yet? So that was I was thinking. And then, yeah. Oh, and then Professor Saul, I'm sure that it was not his emphasis here, but when he was talking about we gotta be together, Americans, Japanese, Koreans are together to deal with the elimination of the what was denied. But I probably want to know more about where North Korea stands in this collaboration. Yeah, but I'm sure that you have written about North Korea somewhere else, but that really made me wonder where North Korea stands in this working together to deal with the issues that you mentioned. Thank you.
Our next discussant is Professor In-Kyu Kang. He drove from Penn campus. Thank you so much for coming. And Professor In-Kyu Kang is in journalism and communication at Penn State University, Marion College. Having earned his MA and PhD in media and cultural studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he also taught there before transitioning to Penn State. His experience extends internationally, encompassing visiting scholar positions at Rikkyo University and St. Petersburg State University in Russia. His primary research interests include global media, visual semiotics, and new media technology. He didn't write it, but I would like to also add that the Professor In-Kyu Kang has been a citizen journalist for Omae News for a number of years. Thanks.
Okay, let me give you brief. So, I'd like to thank all presenters for offering such profound insights. When I was listening to you, it really reminded me of how profoundly colonialism is embedded in the fabric of society and how deeply it is internalized within individual consciousness, making it so difficult to overcome these legacies. And I'm a media scholar and I'm doing research about how technology evolves with the society and how it is represented in culture. And more recently, I'm focused to research about how Japanese, post-war Japanese animation expresses both longing for and fear of technology. And these presentations inspired me to investigate technology, more specifically our attitude toward technology in terms of colonial legacies. I'd like to share that. Some of my happiest childhood memories are watching Japanese TV series, among them Astro Boy and Galaxy Express 39 left particularly strong impressions on me. Even as a child, I sensed how unusually philosophical and at times overwhelmingly somber these stories were. They dealt with identity crisis between humans and machines and the themes of life and death. It wasn't until much later that I understood how these themes are closely tied to Japan's experience with modernization and the war. For Japan, technology carries complex meanings. The country embraced Western technology in an effort to stand alongside global powers, but that same pursuit also contributed to imperial ambitions, ultimately leading to war and devastation. In the aftermath of World War II, Japanese society developed an ambivalent attitude toward technology, marked by both hope and fear. This emotional tension runs deep throughout Japanese popular culture. Let's consider Astro Boy. He is a robot created by a scientist who replaces his deceased son. His power source is nuclear energy, hence the name Atom. Astro Boy symbolizes Japan's post-war national reconstruction. But there's a deep irony at the heart of this narrative. The very force that destroyed a nation, nuclear power, is reimagined as the force that will rebuild the nation. The nuclear energy by portraying it as a source of hope and progress. However, this gradual shift in public perception has laid the groundwork for another catastrophic consequence, the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. Both Korea and Japan are technologically advanced nations, yet their attitudes toward technology differ significantly. Japan, having experienced both glory and tragedy through technology, approaches it with a mixture of admiration and caution. However, South Korea tends to view technology in a more assertively positive light. This attitude is deeply tied to our own colonial history, the trauma of division, and the devastation of war. For many Koreans, the belief that a failure to modernize earlier caused these national hardships has fueled a sense of urgency in adopting new technologies. Sometimes, however, this attitude leads to a kind of uncritical faith in technology. I believe this too is a form of colonialism, one we must recognize and work to overcome. Let me now turn to the recent global obsession, artificial intelligence. The South Korean government has placed AI as the center of its national industrial strategy. But the problem lies in the overwhelming optimism that dominates AI discourse. It has become so pervasive that it overshadows other urgent global issues, such as the unchecked proliferation of nuclear energy, climate change, and widening inequality. In fact, since the rise of chatbot in late 2022, media coverage of the climate crisis has significantly declined, including in the US and South Korea. Japan and Korea share many societal challenges, declining birth rates, aging populations, and a growing sense of disconnection among youth. We can draw on each other's experiences and wisdom to confront these issues together. To this, I would add one more shared need, that is, the cultivation of a critical and balanced perspective on technology, especially technologies like nuclear energy and artificial intelligence, which can have an enormous impact on humanity. Technology is not a merely tool. It is a mirror of society and a language that reveals the direction in which we are heading. Faced with innovations like AI, we must discuss not only efficiency and growth, but also the value of memory, responsibility, and reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last discussion is in Korea, right? Yeah. So now we have Professor Dae-young Ye at Suncheon National University. Professor Ye earned a PhD in modern history from Department of Korean History at Korea University. He has taught at Korea University, Gyeongsang University, and Korea National University of Transportation, and is currently serving as a research professor at the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences at Suncheon National University. Professor Ye, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you for inviting me as a discussant to this valuable academic conference. As I am studying for Korean contemporary history, I will primarily ask a question to Professor Dong-Shin regarding the topic. I have three questions. First, I found your presentation paper interesting to read. I agree with your concerns that the state's memorial rituals for fallen soldiers control and manage women's lives. However, to express your concern more directly, I think the term 미망인, widow in English, 미망인 literally meaning one who has not yet followed in death, could be replaced with a different word. To better highlight the agency of the surviving woman, a more precise term might be appropriate. I imagine you have considered this. How might we express it? Second, I agree with your critical perspective on the genderization of war memory. You described women's autonomous voices existed in 1960, but disappeared after 1963. You explained this as being subsumed by nationalist masculinity. However, as you know, 1960 was a space opened by democracy due to April Revolution, 4.19, a period when diverse voices emerged, not only from the families of fallen soldiers, but also from the families of those most killed. After that, all those voices were silenced due to the May 16 military coup, 5.16. In that sense, I think it's better to explain women's agency in terms of its connection to democracy rather than nationalist masculinity. Third, you stated that it is necessary to compare the activities of Korean women with those in other countries. In particular, you mentioned that while Japan moved toward the peace movement opposing war, but Korea moved toward the direction that reshaped nationalist masculinity, such as supporting the Vietnam War deployment. I think the reason lies in the condition of division of Korean Peninsula. Even though both countries suffered war damage, Japan likely faced relatively fewer ideological constraints, whereas in Korea, such issues were readily linked to accusation of being pro-North Korea. In that regard, I believe it would be meaningful to seek reasons within more Korean-specific contexts, such as inter-Korean division and democracy, rather than simply reducing the generalization of memory to nationalist masculinity. I will conclude the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that I made another mistake. What's new? So we have the last, really last, last discussion of this session, Dr. Hyung-Buk Song, who is here in person. And Dr. Hyung-Buk Song earned his PhD in sociology at the Graduate School of Seoul University, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation titled A Study of North Korea Reform and Opening during the Kim Jong-un era from the perspective of systemic change. Dr. Song served as the chair of the steering committee of Peace Network, a prominent NGO in South Korea dedicated to promoting peace on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. He also completed the Inter-Korean Community Building Program at the University of North Korean Studies, during which time he held leadership roles such as president of the North Korean Research. Dr. Song. Thank you.
안녕하십니까. 평화의 토크에서 얘기하는 성현입니다.
Hello, I'm the chairperson of the steering committee of Peace Network in Korea.
동아시아 북미기획단 이론으로 국교정상화 협회 총회에 대해서 이렇게 하고 있습니다.
It is truly an honor for me to take part in this workshop at the Pennsylvania State University, which is being held in historical meaningful year 2025.
식민지 지배와 조선인 잠복 문제를 해결하기 위한 방안이 무엇일까를 생각하고 이 문제를 가지고 숱한 답을 찾기 위하여 한일 국교 수립 60주년을 맞이한 이 시점에 우리는 다시 한번 지혜를 모아 해결 방법을 찾아야 한다고 생각합니다. 지기 선생님은 전범 처리 문제를 제시하는데 세 가지 방법을 제시하고 있습니다.
Let me first begin by paying my deep respect to Professor Aiko Uzumi, who has devoted her life to researching and addressing the issue of Korean Class B and C work criminals. She has constantly asked important and difficult questions.
먼저 역사적 진실 규명과 일본 정부의 책임을 인정해라는 것입니다. 박주민 선생은 조선인 CC 전범 문제를 문제는 일본 대국주의 식민지배의 책임이라고 강조하십니다. 이 중에 첫 번째는 이중 피해자 문제입니다. 연합국으로부터 전범으로 처벌받았지만 일본 정부로부터는 일본인이 아니라는 이유로 보상에서 제외되는 피해를 당합니다. 두 번째는 진정한 사과입니다. 일본 정부가 이 사실을 공식적으로 인정하고 피해자들에게 진심 어린 사과를 해야 한다고 주장하십니다. 단순한 정치적인 제스처가 아니라 진정한 역사의 책임을 다하는 행위를 해야만 미래를 향한 첫걸음이라고 말씀하십니다.
On the 60th anniversary of Korean-Japan commemorative normalization, her work challenges us once again to seek wisdom and collective solutions. According to Professor Uzumi, there are three main approaches to resolving this historical issue. The first is establishing historical truth and acknowledging responsibility. Professor Uzumi emphasizes that the essence of the problem lies in Japanese colonial rules and imperial responsibility. Koreans who were conscripted into the Japanese military or proceed into service did not choose this path voluntarily. Yet after Japanese defeat, they were punished as war criminals by the Allies and later excluded from compensations by the Japanese government on the grounds that they were not Japanese. Thus, they became double victims. For true resolution, the Japanese government must firmly acknowledge these facts and extends a sincere apology not as a mere political gesture, but as a genuine act of historical responsibilities and the first step towards a reconciled future.
예, 두 번째는 법적, 제도적 해결을 특별법 제정으로 요청하고 계십니다. 보상 및 역사적 진실을 인정하는 것에서 나아가 구체적인 법적, 제도적 조치가 필요하다고 강조하시면서 보상 및 명예회복, 즉 일본 정부가 별도의 특별법을 제정하여야 하며 이 특별법은 조선인 반범 희생자들과 유족에게 정당한 보상을 해야 하고 이들의 명예를 회복시키는 내용을 담아야 된다고 하십니다. 두 번째는 불평등 해소입니다. 모두에 얘기했던 것처럼 조선인 전범들은 보상 대상에 대해서 명백한 차별이므로 이 불평등을 해소하기 위해서 법적 근거를 마련해야 한다고 말씀하십니다.
Second is legal and institutional measures through special legislation. Beyond recognition of historical truth, Professor Utsumi insists that legal and institutional steps are indispensable. She has long argued for a special law that would provide just compensation and restore the honor of Korean victims and their families. Unlike Japanese working laws, Koreans were excluded from any redress. This clear discrimination must be corrected through legal measures that guarantees equality and justice.
세 번째는 한일 시민사회의 역할을 연대해야 한다고 말씀하십니다. 한일 정부 간의 교착 상태를 넘기 위해서는 민간인 역할이 매우 중요하다고 강조하시고 그래서 부 선생님은 진정 어린 마음으로 한일 공동연구와 교류를 말씀하십니다. 일본인 특사로서 한국인 피해자들과 연대하여 동진회 같은 단체를 구성하여 활동하는 것을 지원하는 것을 대표적인 사례로 들고 있습니다. 두 번째는 공동연구와 교류입니다. 죄송합니다. 미래 세대에 대한 교육입니다. 주민 선생은 미래 세대에게 올바른 역사인식을 심어주는 것이 중요하다고 하시면서 일본의 과거사를 솔직히 알리는 강연과 교육 활동을 적극 참여하시고 계십니다. 그 후속 조치로 아마 지금 현재 운영하고 있는 신세대 즉 MPA 평해교육은 남은 인생의 여정을 마치지 않는다 생각이 듭니다.
Third is the role and solidarity of civil society. Finally, Professor Utsumi highlights the crucial role of civil society in overcoming the deadlock between governments. She believes that Korean and Japan's civil organizations must jointly study history, share perspectives, and build solidarity. Furthermore, she has dedicated her last years to peace education for younger generation, ensuring that Japanese youth learn to think about their national past.
정리를 하자면 우츠미와이코 선생님은 조선인 비시전범 문제를 해결하기 위하여 그 일환으로 오늘 우리가 연대 역사를 진행하고 있지 않는다고 동아시아 평화실현 과제를 북미와 동아시아 시민사회의 지대를 통해 한국전쟁 종결 및 시민지 청산하는 모색을 가지고 이 자리를 빌려서 우츠미 선생님이 조선인 반범 문제, 자국인 대한민국 어느 지식이 못지않게 열의와 정열로 조선인 반범 문제를 해결하고 위해 지금까지 노력을 하시면서 다시 한번 더 존경을 표합니다. 시간 제약으로 김민철 서대정 두 선생님의 토론 코멘트를 생략함을 더불어 이해해 주시고 이 토론에 제 토론에 통역해 주신 우리 김지은 이사장님한테 뜨거운 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
I would like to take this opportunity to express once again my profound respect for Professor Utsumi's long dedication, which is no less passionate than that of any Korean intellectual committee to these cups. Thank you very much.
And we go translator. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is a record breaking, 3.5 hours. Nobody moved. There was no break, right? And the whole time, we treating this really, really engaging. Oh, you want to, yeah? Oh, okay. Do you want to say something? Okay, so I just want to say that I really appreciate everybody. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And
our colleagues and our graduate students who are here. We're going to continue our conversation in a different place, but thank you so much. And Professor Lee has
Thank you for so much for a long time. It's a wonderful workshop. I think it's the beginning of our new collaboration. And then Uchimeko is maybe impressed with her. Let me explain about that. She published a new book about the Sugamo prison. And then now in Japan, she have an exhibition about the Sugamo prison. And then she donated this book to the Easter. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. These go guys. Yeah. Now, are you hungry? You're very hungry. So we are so determined to feed our guests really well since yesterday. And I'm really happy that we enjoy food in Penn State area. So we're gonna move to Nittany's Lion Inn where there's a restaurant. And the presenters and discussers need to take your bags from my bag. And those of you who are moving with us, could you help us to guide to the hotel? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. My Professor Fujitani Takashi, Professor Lisa Yoneyama, Professor John Thompson, and Professor Yedeo. And it's so great to see you. Thank you so much. I hope I see you soon. Yeah. Yes, Jiun Kang, who translated for us. And then there's 허미선 선생님, who translated into Japanese. And thank you so much. We don't see your face, but you've been tremendously helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sorry, we needed a last take a picture because just
듣겠습니다. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
one more.
좋습니다.
좋습니다.
하겠습니다. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Cheese. 1, 2, 3. Please.